So this is Iain McGilchrist. Iain McGilchrist is it was clinical psychologist, and who they in Scotland, and spent time also in England, and then also moved to the United States and began working in a neuroscience lab, and then went back to England and Europe and moved more in academia, and he slowly morphed from that medical science background into a very respected scholar and philosopher and writer. And this book, which he undertook, is, well, to say a little bit more than that in a second. When I first heard about this guy, I was like, who is this person? I want to find out about it. So I went on to YouTube, and the very first thing I saw was a YouTube video with of him in a conversation with John Cleese from Monty Python. And I was like, well, this is going to be an interesting guy. That was not what I expected to see from this person who's um, an icon in academia. And they had this great conversation. As some of you might know, John Cleese is, I believe he's an MD. And so I'm not sure if that's true. I think it is, but he has a pretty deep science background. So they have this great conversation, but they're also kidding around, as one would imagine. And there's a whole bunch of videos that you can find of those two talking. But with the main point I wanted to show with this, or mention this slide, if you get interested in this, and the best place to go is go into YouTube or go to the McGilchrist website, which is easy to find. You can find a ton of videos of him talking, and he's very eloquent, and he talks in terms that lay people can understand. And it's a great way to get an introduction to both his work and the person. So here are the two books, The Matter with Things, and here The Matter with Things, it's What's the Matter with Everything is kind of the idea, with the subtitle Our Brains Are Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. It's 2,000 pages long, 1,500 pages of text, 500 pages of notes, bibliography, all those kind of things. And then each page in the column has further notes. So it's unbelievable how thoroughly it's notated and with sub details. Took him 10 years to write this book. And it comes on the heels of another book, which is also about the brain, called The Master and the Emissary. So here is, he tackles with just a few small questions to move this here. Like, who are we? What is the world? How can we understand consciousness, matter, space, and time? Is the cosmos without purpose or value? Is the world essentially inert and mechanical, nothing but a collection of things for our use? Are we ourselves nothing but the playthings of chance, embroiled in a war of all against all? And then can we really neglect the sacred and divine? And that last question is one of the ones that's one of my most favorite, because this whole book is heavy, heavy, heavy science. And then at the last few chapters, he completely flips it and goes into realms that most scientists won't want to write about because that's not their expertise, around spirituality and religion and philosophy. So it's really amazing and I think very fun combination. So we're all aware that the brain is we have certain specialties and ways where we process different things in the brain. That's common knowledge now, and there's also, I think, fairly common knowledge that different parts of the brain, more at a bigger level, the way we think. It's not just about how we take in data, and where vision is processed and those things, but also how we think, that also is more or less split right side, left side on the hemispheres. Now we have to be careful here, because if you take that too rigidly, it'll be wrong. Both sides can do all sorts of things that the other side can do. It's a degree of how good they are at it would be a simple way to see it and say it. And there's also a lot that flows between the two sides, the two hemispheres, and a back and forth process for a third structure in the brain. So can't take this to the extreme, too literally, too black and white, I guess would be the right phrase. So a way to get at it is some of people will talk about, and personally I'm going to talk about in a little bit, Daniel Kahneman, they talk about the thinking in level one and level two. So level one thought is, if I ask you what's 1 + 1, you say 2. instantly you've got it. 1 plus 1 equals 2. If I ask you what's 20 times 2,486, you're not going to knock that answer right out. You have to go think about that. So that's a level 2 kind of thinking. So that's happening more on the right side, or is more collaboration on the right and left side in those kind of problems versus the very simple problem. The left side is also um, key. The belief is that a lot of what happens in the left side is happens through because of well, it's easier to explain it through evolutionary biology. So that's the side that where we have our antenna up for if we're cave people and we're walking through the tundra and we're looking for in the high grasses near us, what's going on with the grasses, how's it moving? Is there a predator that's about to come in and get us? So that's your awareness and looking for threats point of view. The other side would be more on the strategic side and be able to see longer term trends to maybe if you're standing, to use this analogy, you're standing up on a hill and you see grass moving in different places, and then you begin to get a picture. Oh, wait, there's not just one animal, there's a herd. So you're analyzing the incoming data and you're beginning to, based on your experience, you come up with a picture of what's going on. So that's kind of the difference between these two. So you can see the way the ones on the left are labeled, training math, rule orientation, extreme rule orientation. That's what happens on the left side. And on the other side, you have the more creativity, intuition, the arts, creation, feeling, imagination. And one that's not here that's real important is strategic thinking. And most of us on this call are, or many of us, I can't see everybody right now, are older. And one thing you'll be happy to know that is, among other things, when folks do testing on older folks, it turns out that we're all very good at strategic thinking compared to our younger cohabitants of the planet. And a big part of that is because of our life experience. And that gets parked into our brain. And we use those experiences to be able to analyze things that are going on and apply, be in one situation, but you can use your experience from other situations to help you get through that new situation. So that a lot of that is happening on the right side of our brains and is one of the of several areas where we get much better as we get older. So it's broken into these two pieces, and I'll just read this. The first is the hemispheres and the means to truth. And usually when you see things in italics here, these are direct quotes out of the book. If we are interested in the truth, we ought to be interested in the mind through which it might be apprehended. And if we're interested in the capacities and limitations of the mind, we should be interested in the capacities and limitation of the brain. So that all of that is kind of related very much to what I just talked about and how our brain is wired and all those kind of things, kind of the mechanics, the physics, the biology. But then the second part is, all right, now we have this capacity to ascertain what's going on in the world, but then we come to the bigger questions. And since the Enlightenment, well, I'll read this. I should read that. I take it that these paths to truths can be encompassed under the very broad and to some extent overlapping headings of science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And one of McGilchrist's key arguments, which is becoming more prevalent in other places, is when the Age of Enlightenment came and we began to focus on science and reason, we lost our, we just wasn't we lost our, intuition and imagination. We all have that, but they became more denigrated. To be one way to say it, they were not trusted. They weren't in when talking about the problems of the world, explaining them and explaining solutions. That was all kind of pushed down, and that's had some ramifications. And this is one of the arenas where he's arguing that we're out of balance today. Our left hemispheres in the developed world are dominating our right hemispheres, and this is one big area. So we'll talk about that in a moment. A nice way to enter into this is to think about the word obvious. So the Latin for that is the definition is of the translation, that which is in the way, presenting itself readily, open, exposed, commonplace. So the example I gave before about the lion, and the coming out in the path, that's the thing that you're looking for. There's an old, and it's immediate, and it's in the way. And there's an old story that's I've heard in multiple places, when the idea is that there's a man, and the man is put into a dark cell with a window, but it's darkness. And he's under there under quite duress. He's been thrown into the cell. And as he sits there and he begins to acclimate to a light, in what little light there is, in the corner he sees a coiled up thing, and he believes it's a coiled up snake. And the entire night he does not sleep. He's unable to sleep because he's just doesn't want to move. He doesn't want to get struck by the snake. But as the dawn comes and a little bit of light comes in through the little window at the top, he comes to the realization it's not a snake at all. It's just a little coil of rope. And so that's kind of the idea of this immediate response and misinterpreting what's going on as opposed what's really going on, and then how you have an emotional response clearly to that situation. The more subtle thing here about obvious is that we all come to believe certain things are obvious, but they're not. But we lock that in our head. We have some kind of thing that's happening. We think, well, that's obviously true. But if we haven't really thought it through, it could be that that's not correct. So in that sense, something being obvious gets in the way. So there's two kind of a paradoxical nature to the word obvious. So let's talk about this, what McGilchrist gets at we're going to start with a psychological point of view and different work that's been done to look at that. So another old story is there's a guy walking down the street, slowly walking down the street late in the evening, and up ahead of him he sees young man under a lamp, and he's intently looking for something. And the man strolling by looks at the younger man, and he just keeps walking. But he as he walks by, he realizes this person looks very disturbed, and he's very upset. So he's thinking, maybe I should go back and help this guy. So he goes back and he's looking around, and he doesn't see anything. So he says to the man, what is it you're looking for? And he goes, well, I'm looking for a locket. And the other fellow says, well, tell me about it. Well, it's about the size of a quarter and has a picture of my daughter in it. I cannot lose this locket. So the man says, oh, I'm going to help you. And so he goes down, he's looking around real carefully. And after a bit, he's like, well, how can it be? I can't see this locket. So he says, well, where exactly did you lose it? And the young man looks up and he points down into a dark alley. He goes, over there. And the older man goes, well, what are you doing? I mean, why are you looking here? And then the younger man looks up to him and he goes, well, what are you, crazy? The light stinks over there. So it's this idea of looking in we have we're caught within a certain view of the world, and there can be a lot going on outside that view of the world. And we need to, as we're thinking through problems and questions and challenges in the world, to be receptive to the idea that there might be things going on that we're not open to, and to try to think about those things and make sure we're in the light, or we have the ability to see things and be curious. So with a lot of people in really starting the 50s, starting with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who I'll talk about in a second, they began to take these ideas, many of which are common sense little sayings that we have and things. And they began about how people think, and began to really investigate them in a more systematic way. So these two psychologists in 2000 printed a paper, and they become quite famous, called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And that's basically the idea that people with low skill in a specific area often greatly overestimate their competence in that area. So the easy um, thing that expression we all often use is the Monday morning quarterback. So you have it, and it's also the idea that having a little information is worse than having no information, because with a little bit of information, you may decide you know a lot more than you do. And they went through this very methodically and showed that this is a very common challenge, shall we say, for each of us. going beyond that and starting earlier is the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who began in the 50s. These are two, at the time, young Israelis, American Israelis in one case, and the other, Amos Tversky grew up in France, but ended up in Israel. They begin to have this very interesting collaboration, which goes on their whole lives, and ends up with Kahneman winning a Nobel Prize, and Tversky did not win it because he had passed away before that. And that idea that I just talked about, they began to really look into these, and then this is now a huge field, and there's over 100 cognitive biases that people. So a bias is something that pushes us to exclude whatever doesn't fit in whatever our thinking is. And the ways in which things don't fit take on different dimensions. So one that would be pretty common that we think about a lot is confirmation or my side bias. So we judge new ideas based on the degree to which they conform and confirm our current point of view, including our current ideas, our current information, and especially our trusted authorities. So we don't like things that challenge us. It's just a kind of simple thing, and that has all sorts of implications. The next one is complexity bias, which is, the title says it all. We don't like complexity. We like simple answers. Sorry, I'm trying to move this one screen here. Here we go. We prefer simplicity. We don't like complex answers. And I don't know, I myself, I can very easily every day think of examples out of my own thinking and how I do things. And the next one is comfort or complacency bias. So we avoid short-term discomfort, sometimes at the expense of long-term well-being and what we deeply, truly believe. So the idea of these biases, it's very important or helpful to be aware of them. It's good to go learn about them because we all do them all the time. And it affects every aspect of our lives, including how we interact with others. It underlies all sorts of the things that people talk about these days in our inability to talk to people on the other side and those kind of things. And a lot of the things that people talk about with what social media is doing in terms of how people think and how they're coming to conclusions and how we're being manipulated. Well, that's those things that we talk a lot about, hear people talk about. There's a lot of science behind it. That's just not made up stuff. And the work of Kahneman and Tversky was pivotal in bringing that about. There's two great books. One is by Michael Lewis called The Undoing Project, and it's about the relationship between Tversky and Kahneman, which is its own fascinating, very cool story, but also the work that they did. And you learn a lot about their work in reading that book. And then once Kahneman wrote a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is also, it's really well written. It's more dense. It's less on the relationship between the two men and more about the actual work. But the way they went about this work and its impact is astounding. There are very few fields that have not been impacted by what they've done. And so obviously there'd be work within psychology, but then they quickly, if you've heard of the phrase behavioral economics, that basically came from Kahneman and Tversky's work. They had a lot of influence on military, the way the military does things, including evaluating potential soldiers and strategies. And that's kind of actually where they started because of the conflict in Israel in the 50s and 60s, and on and on and on and on. And it's just a fascinating story and also a good thing to know about. Uh, oh, there we go. So another part of what McGilchrist talks about is more on the less on the psychological side, or it goes more toward where there are issues where people have a deficit that's that's beyond the normal range, say we put it that way. And that deficit might be something they were born with. It might be a deficit that they acquired due to an illness. It might be a deficit that they acquired during an injury or due to an injury. And this is where this part of the mapping happens, because if you can, through some sort of testing, which I'll talk about in a second, where you can actually see what part of the brain is damaged, and then you look at what the person's behavior is, you can begin with enough of those people. In this case, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people over time, and maybe even more than that. You begin to come to observations about that support this idea of what's happening in which side of the brain. So in this case, this is a person who has a right hemisphere damage due to a stroke, and it's going to be the example here. And there's a little puzzle, and the puzzle is that you have this figure on the left. There's a head, a torso, two arms, and two legs. And the person is given those as separate things and then asked to, put them together. And the person on the left, it comes out the way you expect. But the person on the right, or the subject on the right, who created the image on the right, has this a right hemisphere deficit. So the person who put it together on the left does not have the deficit. The person on the right does, and you can see they've generally got the idea. They understand that they're parts to a body. They understand roughly where the parts to the body should go, but they don't step back from the whole image and see, oh wait, the whole image is not correct, that we haven't integrated this in correctly. So that's one type of test that's used to begin to get at the question of how people think and put things together. A lot of work, and what I'm talking about here, McGilchrist spends 300 pages talking about what I'm going to do in 2 or 3 slides. And so there's a lot more here, but he has a big section about schizophrenia, and he also has a big section about autism. And those two sections help a lot with the kind of thing that I just talked about a second ago with that diagram. So with schizophrenia, let me read the quote first. Schizophrenia is very much like a left hemisphere overdrive and a right hemisphere deficit state. Patients are often highly skeptical of ordinary things of everyday life, while highly gullible about things that are not true. So in the little diagram, you can see if you have functional distrust, you're not gullible and you don't tend to go with irrational beliefs. That's what that diagram is trying to say. But if you have dysfunctional distrust, you tend to be more gullible and you tend to be more accepting of irrational beliefs. And I would imagine that many of you are looking at that slide and thinking about examples that you're seeing in society of that kind of challenge around gullibility and irrational beliefs. And that's what he's trying to say is that's real, and there is and thinking about in the brain science that supports why that is happening. I guess I'll summarize it that way. The last stage of this I want to talk about is more on the physical side. So we've talked about in terms of injury, and where the clarity about what's going on is even more obvious. So we talked about psychology. We talked about inferences from people with certain kind of deficits, and then here we can talk about people who have actually been injured. So you may well have heard if you took an introductory psychology class, you would have heard of this case. And it's maybe in other places. So it's the case of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was a railroad work crew manager. And one of the things that he supervised was the use of explosives to break rock and that kind of work. And so he was a very amiable, smart guy, careful, thoughtful. People really liked this man. And he was walking along some of the areas where they were clearing out rocks so they could put in the train tracks. And he happened to step up to this group just as they were uh, basically triggering a small piece of dynamite. I mean, it wasn't really an explosion. What they're trying to do is create a small, narrow hole. And so they had the spike in the ground. They had the explosive underneath it. The explosive went off. The spike came out of the ground. and it hit him in the head and came up through his jaw and went up through or behind his left eye. So, obviously severe damage, but by some miracle, he didn't die. He recovered. He lived for another 12 years. And what happened to him initially was the doctor, it obviously took him a good year before he could even do the most basic of things. But the doctor noticed over time that his description was he's fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom. So his behavior radically, in addition to lose some functionality like his left eye, and then clearly sections of his brain, his behavior radically changed. And this was the beginning of the recognition that the brain has different regions where things happen. There began to be the speculation about that that came out of the case with Gage. The other thing that's interesting, that'll come up a little bit again later, is as he recovered from this thing, he then he went to Chile and he became a stagecoach driver, which was not a simple thing because you had to remember the routes. You're going through the countryside. You had to learn the routes. You had to remember what to look for, all those kind of things, in addition to just handling the administrative tasks of bringing people and goods back and forth. And he did that quite well. And he was quite healthy. And also his personality began to shift again. He began to go back to the way he was before, although never completely. But he became far more the person he had been before than anybody would have expected. So now we fast forward to the 80s. And there was a meeting with the Dalai Lama held in the 1980s with a group of neuroscientists from all over the world, a small group. And if you don't know much about Buddhism, one of the principal parts of Buddhism is the science of psychology. They have a science of psychology that comes out of Buddhist beliefs in addition, and that kind of underpins a whole lot about Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama and also Buddhism has always been receptive to science, not fighting science. So basically what the Dalai Lama said to these neuroscientists, he said, well, if if meditation has the healthy impact that we say it does, based on our ability to control our thoughts, which then control some of our physiological responses to different stressful conditions, among other things. And you have this gear, this fascinating new equipment. We should, let's see if you can see these things. So that's what began in the 80s and continues to this day. And in one example, the person on the left, the bottom left there, the idea is you put a net of electrodes over someone's head, and then you give them a certain task, sort of certain focus on X or focus on Y, or try to bring up some emotion or those kind of things. You give them a task, and then you begin to see if you can change, if you can see what is happening in the brain. And the interesting thing about here, it made a lot of sense to start with meditators because meditators, and these are people who have meditated for more than typically 10,000 hours. So you know, uh, these are the people who surround the Dalai Lama and spent all this time doing this work and have been doing this for thousands of years. And one person in particular is Mathieu Ricard, who's a Frenchman who had a PhD in microbiology, and he becomes a Buddhist monk and very close to the Dalai Lama to this day. So he bridges this world, these two worlds, very nicely. So he's one of the primary initial subjects that goes through this kind of testing. And that it continues to this day. I'll give some more example. And then as time went on, now we have the MRI machines, and MRI machines have much more capability, and they're less crude than the electrodes. The electrodes have the beauty is they're fast, so fast changes can be picked up by the electrodes, where the MRI machine is kind of doing averaging things, so it's not as fast. But the MRI machine gives you much more detail. So let's give one example of what came out of this. So in one of their early experiments, what they asked the Mathieu Ricard and others was they would give them a certain meditation task. And so they would have a task where they're supposed to meditate on whatever it might be. say a flower, or picture a flower. And then they would, and they'd ask them to do that for 10 minutes. And then they would to have the same thing, but then they would put in through some earphones or something to try to, in addition to the person's own thoughts, might take them away from what they're supposed to focus on. Let's give them a stimulus they're not expecting. So let's give them some noise or something that they're not expecting that's to throw them off from their meditation. And do this over and over and over again. And what they began to see was that people who are long-term meditators go through this process. So let me start. On the bottom left is the stabilizing focus. So this is Matthew Ricard focusing on the flower. In the second phase, his mind begins to wander. And so in that, different parts of his brain to begin to light up in this testing apparatus. Then he becomes aware of the fact that his mind has wandered and he's distracted. And then he goes down to the fourth thing, which is the reorientation of like, oh, I'm distracted. I have to come back to what it was I was focusing on, which brings him back to the stabilizing focus on the flower. So there's this cycle. And through the course of these types of testing, they've been actually able to show what parts of the brain light up as he's going through this process. And you can imagine it's quite fast. This is happening on the millisecond level as you go through this. And any of you who've been through meditation, you know very well the whole mind wandering thing. That's the center of it all. And the key to meditation, or one of the keys to meditation, we're actually doing the process, is that point at which you become aware of your distraction and you bring yourself back to the point of focus. You can't stop your mind from wandering. That's that's just not a thing that's possible. And even meditators like Matthew Ricard talk about that all the time. There's a lot of misunderstanding about meditation in that regard. The idea is to stabilize your focus on something. And if you think about it from a behavioral point of view, well, suppose your stabilizing focus is to be kind. So you're thinking about kindness. And then you go through this whole process. And what happens is you begin to train yourself so that when something happens, for example, with kindness, and you get angry, and you're starting to get angry, you stop for a second. You become aware of the fact that you're angry, and then you insert this idea of kindness, if you know what I mean. So that's a fundamental part of meditation, and actually is a core of many of the oldest um, meditation techniques going back thousands of years. It's about finding happiness, but it's about being able to understand your emotions and control them in a way that's appropriate. I'll just summarize it with that. So really fascinating, all of that work. So with that, so anyway, you bring all those tools together, I should say, and that's how we have become much more knowledgeable about what happens in what parts of the brain. And then we're going to go into a little bit more about.
Is Linda.
Yes, hi, Linda.
Hi. Okay, great. So I typed my question in the chat, but I'll just read it. I
Okay.
thought that the left brain, right brain dichotomy was kind of out of date because I thought that the new understanding of the brain was that it was a network and that, it's more of a web than two halves.
Nope. Um, yeah, there's two things there. So one thing that's changed is the thinking about which is the controlling side has changed. So it used to be people thought all the stuff that I was talking about happened in the left hemisphere. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the processes, everything that I'm talking about isn't completely, you can't argue everything's on one side and not on the others. And so there's information going back and forth between them all the time through the corpus callosum and other pathways. And that structure is not understood. It's mind-bogglingly complicated. And there is information going back all the time and impacting everything. So it is a web. It is a web in that way. Um, but it's just kind of the emphasis of where particular things are happening, tending to happen more in one side than the other, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Laura Quinlan wonders if that statement, I guess the meditation statement, that you were talking about is more about mindfulness. Laura, do you want to present that or you want me to just read it?
Uh, yeah, I was just trying to sort out to what degree it sounded to me in my world. I'm more familiar with the concept of mindfulness, where someone could be aware that they feel angry, but at the same time, they are aware that they have more than just anger. And there's other levels of feelings, and they can make a choice to say, you know what, I also feel kindness at this time. Or so it just kind of a statement that caught my eye, caught me. I interpret it differently, I think, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does a lot. I'm going to explain this the way I understand it, and there might be people who are neuroscientists and deep meditators who would explain it in a different way, but this is the way I look at it. So I think of meditation as it's going to the gym for your brain. And when I go to the gym, I can choose to work on all sorts of things. I can choose to work on my endurance. I can choose to work on my biceps. I can, if I've got an injury, I can choose to work on it. But the underlying thing is the repetition, and that the repetition done in a certain way, I can heal myself, and then also protect myself from future injury. So that's how I think about meditation broadly. And so you can have a specific thing where if you have, in this case of the example I use, if you have an issue and you get angry in situations you shouldn't be, you can apply it to that specific challenge or problem. Or you could, if you want to inculcate other types of behavior, you can pick those. A very different realm is there's a book, actually, I've got it right here, called Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach. Some of you may have heard of Tara Brach. Tara Brach is also a psychologist. And what Tara talks a lot about is how do you deal with difficult things? And I mean really difficult. Well, from really difficult to not so difficult, but let's talk about really difficult. So childhood traumas, the traumas that many of us are undergoing right now because of what's happening in the political sphere, deep, deep, deep problems, and to help you to understand how to move through them and get through them, which is a different problem than a specific response to a specific stimulus, if put it that way. Something's happened in your past or happening to you right now that is very upsetting. And so mindfulness meditation can be used to do that. So meditation is a big thing, and then underneath it, there's different buckets. And I think people get caught up with this, or I learned this myself. People get caught up with these different sub buckets and not realizing it's actually part of a bigger, shall we say, strategy. And if you're in get into reading the Buddhism in particular, you begin to see that because they talk about it in that way. And as it turns out, all of the major religious traditions have a contemplative, meditative tradition. Most of us don't realize that, but it's not just the Buddhists. It's across the board. But the Buddhist is a little more developed in this sense because they have this real focus on psychology. So I don't know if that rambling helps, but that's the way I think about it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Thanks.
Thanks. Now here's a really interesting comment from Melanie Smith. She says, it's interesting to see white male illustrations of the brain. I teach about race and gender in medicine. One area that's poorly understood is the influence of gender on the brain. For example, what we moms call baby brain. Science demonstrates that pregnancy and birth can make a female brain more productive and smarter, better at multitasking, for example. So much research until the 90s was based on white men, and this is changing, but not fast enough.
We could talk about this for a long time.
That's for sure.
Uh, yes, 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 yes. Um, some of this is mostly probably women on this call. I don't know, but as I've gotten older, and my partner who's on the call will call me on this sometimes, but I see a lot of the errors that I've made as a white male, as a male in particular, but the race is also involved. And if you look at through, I mean, look at what's going on in the world right now. So whether it's in Iran or the United States or Russia, who is, the source of the problem? It's an older white male. And it's the whole issue of patriarchy and all those kind of things. And that has been a huge problem through time. That is not unrelated to me to what we're talking about here in terms of the way the brain works, and that there's difference between male and female, and some of it's revolutionary biology, and there may be other things as well. I can't speak with I would speak with even less expertise about that because I've never actually read about those differences in terms of the science behind them. But with the evidence to me on just the day-to-day life is it seems pretty clear. So I think if you
Yeah.
would, that's a great question and makes me, I'm gonna see what I can learn about that because I bet the science backs some of that up. So I'm going to go back to the presentation and then so I can have some time to try to answer more questions at the end. So great questions though.
Dan, before you go, I just want to ask, Barbara says, are we going to get to the hope and joy part of this in the last few minutes, or are we leaving that for another time? Dan is
We
nodding.
are going to get to the hope and joy part.
Thank you.
That's perfect, actually, perfect entry to this next thing. So one of the things McGilchrist does is he begins to talk about, as he shifts from all of that stuff, he begins to shift into an arena of what we don't know and other things. And this is where he starts to move into those other four things where he talks about the reason and science, but then intuition and imagination, and where these two things start to overlap, and then that will lead us into the answer that we're looking for in this session. So when it comes to biology, we're basically flying blind. A lot of the stuff that I just talked about, when you dig under the hood, no one has any idea what's going on. And so what McGilchrist says is that the last century was the century of physics. And this century that we're in now is going to be a century of biology. And we're going to uncover all sorts of wonderful and amazing things. So I'm going to try and talk about that for a minute. So this is a paper, this is excerpts from a New York Times article about a project called the Brain Atlas Project. It was started in 2017. And what they're trying to do is really dig in a more concrete way to this atlas idea. So a mapping of the brain, but dive in at a much, much deeper level. So some quotes from that. The Brain Atlas Project has identified more than 3,300 types of brain cells, an order of magnitude more than was previously supported. This article is written in 2023. Work started in 2017. The researchers have only a dim notion of what the newly discovered cells do. Dr. Lean and his colleagues have only sampled a tiny fraction of the 170 billion cells estimated to make up the human brain, and future surveys certainly cover more cell types. This diagram tries to just show you quickly what's the different things that go on in your brain, the things that are changing. And it's obvious when you're just going through puberty and growing, we all know that our brains change through that stage. And we also know at the end of our lives that our brains change, but actually our brains are changing all the time. And part of it is it's not just due to illness, and it's not just due to injury, it's actually your experience. So the trauma be the obvious, psychological trauma be the obvious one that people are aware of. But actually what you're doing in what we were talking about before around meditation, you're actually changing things, the way things operate in the brain long term. You're just like, muscle gets bigger. Your brain, there are things, physical changes in the brain that come about as through meditation. So that is an indicator or an entry point into the fact that our bodies are changing all over the place all the time. And one of the sciences that have come on in the past 40 years is epigenetics. So epigenetics is the study of how our environment and your behavior can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. So one simple idea that I was not aware of until I read about this stuff is when you pass your genes on to your children, if you have children, choose to have children, The genes that are passed on to your children are not a simple mix of what you were born with and your partner was born with that come together and are given. The genes that are given to the child have been modified. So from the day I was born to the day when we first had children, the genes that actually passed down to my son and daughter are not the genes I was born with. They've been modified. And they've been modified because of the different things that I just described. So the question then becomes, how does that happen? So we all know that we have these strands, which there are enormously complicated strands of genetic material. And epigenetics is tries to get at that. So we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 genes. It used to be that 98% of the genes were considered junk. And not surprisingly, we've come to the recognition, no, they're not junk. They do something, but people don't know what they do. Underneath that, this cell nucleus, which is around 6 millionths of a meter in diameter, contains 6.6 feet of DNA. That feet is geometrically equivalent to taking 24 miles of extremely fine thread. So if you think of your DNA as this thread, woven thread, and taking that and packing that into a tennis ball. So you can see that within a single cell, the complexity of what's in there is just mind-boggling. But your body is able to go into specific cells and groups of cells and go into the DNA there and clip out pieces of DNA and put other DNA in there or other genetic material and replace things depending on what's happening to the body. No one has other than the basic chemistry, no one has any idea how that works. No one has any idea how our body knows, oh, I need to go into those specific cells and replace those specific pieces of DNA with these specific pieces of DNA in response to what's going on. No one has any idea. It is a giant mystery. In related realm, some of you might have seen this movie, The Octopus Teacher, which is just this really wonderful film where this fellow, South African filmmaker, basically tells the story of this one particular octopus. So when you think about an octopus, in which the picture on the left is actually the octopus with shells around it. He's camouflaging himself. There's an octopus in there who's grabbed all these shells and is camouflaging himself. So the octopus is a very unique creature, right? With the tentacles and the suction cups, and its brain is actually distributed throughout its body. It's not in a certain place. And we all know that or most of us probably know, when an octopus loses one of its tentacles, it grows back. And that's part of the film. He shows the octopus getting attacked, and then it withdraws into its cell and stays there for a long time and heals and recovers, comes back, and it's got a new tentacle that's coming out. So the two big points I want to make there is, one, no one has any idea how the octopus, what the biology is that allows the octopus to do that, to regenerate that structure. And more broadly, how is the octopus the octopus? How is it that an octopus has tentacles? How is it that it has distributed brain, and suction cups and does what it does? It's a highly intelligent animal. And then you can extend that to when you're born, if everything goes well, we come out with all our organs intact, with all our appendages intact. We come out a living, breathing, functioning entity. Where is the blueprint for that? And how does that blueprint become us? No one has any idea. And anybody who tells you they do, that's not true. They have vague ideas, but the underlying science of how that's really happening is a complete mystery. So that's kind of the analogy back to 100 plus years ago when Einstein and others were thinking about energy and subatomic physics, and then up to the cosmos. No one had any idea how any of that stuff worked. We could observe it. We could see the sun going up and the sun going down, but we didn't really understand how gravity worked and all those kind of things. But we learned a lot in the last century. So that's what McGilchrist says is coming. So that's one of the things that I want to take away as a highlight. The world is an amazing place, and we don't know much about it. And it's miraculous in some sense. But there is a system in science underneath it as well. So you've got this paradox of these two things. So despite all the craziness that goes on, what goes on in your body every day is incredible and beautiful and amazing. So that's one of the things I hope you take away from tonight. So now in the latter part of the book, last several chapters, McGilchrist stops wandering around in philosophy and other things and goes all over the place. So I'm going to try to give you a sense of some of that. So he talks about there are a few problems. So we have, and it goes back to the imbalance in the brain. There's an imbalance in the pathways to understanding is the way he says it. So as I mentioned before, he has this idea there are four main pathways to understanding: reason, science, intuition, and imagination. And what he's saying is in the contemporary West, as I mentioned before, since the Enlightenment, that's got out of balance. We downplay intuition and imagination. And he tells the story of, again, going back to physics, most of the great physics results of the last century didn't happen because, Einstein was a chalkboard, doing equation after equation, and then he gets the answer. It's the exact opposite. In general, and actually this is way more than in general, it's almost completely true, is all the big breakthroughs happen because the person was working on the problem and thinking about it. But then they use the old thing, they're in the shower and they have this light bulb moment. And then, so that's the intuition, imagination part, which has been triggered by the science and reason that they've done, but also they have this intuitive insight. And then they go back to the chalkboard and they prove it. And that is how all the big breakthroughs in more or less in physics happen, especially in the things that we can't visualize, like the cosmos and cellular things and atomic things. The second thing that he goes into is the concept of value, and this is a really interesting idea. So he says that value is not a flavor that's added for some socially useful purpose. It's not a function or a consequence of something else, but it's a primary fact. So in his argument, values are intrinsic to life, like oxygen. We need oxygen and atoms and things. It's not a human construct is where he goes with this. So it's pretty fascinating. So part of the way he talks about it, and again, this is like 100 pages he talks about this. I'm going to try and summarize it in one diagram, is Max Scheller's pyramid of values. So this is an idea that has been around since, I believe, the 50s. And the idea is that our value system, we go up, and at the bottom of our value system is the basic stuff we need, utility for just basing our needs and wants. And as we move up to a hierarchy of values, they become more abstract and complicated, but fundamental and important. So in the second level, we talk about virtue, courage, loyalty, humility, prudence, compassion. Next one, we go up to wisdom, justice, beauty, truth, learning. And then the top one is the sacredness, the connectedness of all things. And that would be the argument would be here that those things and that progression is what the right hemisphere allows us to do. We see things that way. But the left hemisphere flips things around where in what becomes important is the utility part. So what it is that we get done, busyness, all those kind of things. And then the price we pay for that is we push away the sacred, which we've certainly done in our culture for hundreds of years. And then wisdom, justice, other things there start to get pushed out. And I would argue a lot of us would believe that's happening in our society right now. We're seeing that in the politics and other places. We're seeing a big shift from the 50s and 60s and post-World War II, where courage, loyalty, humility, compassion mattered because of what all those folks went through in the last century between the two world wars and the Great Depression. And they began to shift societally, and now we're kind of falling away from some of those values. So again, he argues that it's a philosophical description of what he believes going on, but he believes that it has a physiological undertone. And what we can all do, and we'll come back to this in a moment, is to think about that hierarchy and that it's important, and that when we interact with each other and our fellow human beings, when we see courage, when we see kindness, when we see those things happening, to A, celebrate it, and B, let the people that are doing that, let them know, because they want to know that. And if we start to all think that way, we can start to change the culture. Another problem is that interesting to think about is our senses are highly limited. And we all know that we only have a certain range of hearing. We all have only a certain range of vision. We can't see infrared light. We can't hear very, very low frequencies and very high frequencies. The dog can hear all those kind of things. There's a great book called The Immense World, and it's about how all the different creatures of the world, including the octopus that we just looked at, how they sense the world. And the underlying biology of that is fascinating. And also, the way that we think of the world is quite different because we can only experience certain things. So, for example, birds and certain types of fish can sense the magnetic field. We can't. And they use that to their advantage. So there is some stuff going on around us in the magnetic field that's part of nature that we cannot observe. And so that's kind of a big example of our inability to really understand fully the miracle and the incredible things that are going on within nature, and another way of thinking about, expanding your horizons. The next problem is the idea of paradox. So I love this little picture, sign not in use. And this is the idea that paradox abounds. Paradox is everywhere, and we don't like paradox. This is one of these biases. But paradox is real. Paradox is something you have to accept, and paradox is actually, once you start to dig into it, becomes a beautiful thing as opposed to a thing that imposes or that challenges us. And I give you one example. So in the picture in the left, we see some chimpanzees highly aggressive in this particular example, and which they can be. They can be quite violent. They can also be, obviously we all know can be quite peaceful, but they can be violent and tribal. And there's certain reasons why those behaviors go on. But also, which might surprise you, chimpanzees can also do complicated tasks in coordination and cooperation with each other. So in this task, you see all the chimpanzees facing this fence, and behind it there's food on the other side of it. But the only way to get the food is there's a tool on the other side, like a thing that has to be drawn toward them. And they all have to cooperate, get it up over the food, and then pull it toward them for each of them to get the food. So they have to cooperate in this task. And they figured it out. They weren't shown by anyone how to do this. They were just, there was this scientific experiment. They showed the food behind the cage. They had the tool there, and the chimpanzees had to go figure it out. And there are incredible examples of how different species do these things. And the paradoxical part here is we think of good and evil as a human failing, and it's not. It is a paradoxical part of nature. So aggression and peacefulness, these kind of things are just built in. And then there's, of course, the question of how you think about that. But I mean, what I'm trying to get at is the point of, if going back to the radical acceptance idea, if you can't, there's a certain element of radical acceptance where you have to accept the fact that there's evils in the world, and it's part of nature, and it's part of everything that existence. And when you start to begin to accept paradoxes like that, and there are all sorts of them, life becomes easier. So it becomes easier again. Left hemisphere wants everything to be black and white. Right hemisphere is able to deal with ambiguity and paradox, and not just accept it, but find the kind of beauty of it. So the final chapter of the book, which is 100 pages, was where he goes from science and he goes into all this other stuff. And he said that chapter alone, which is, like I said, 100 plus pages, took him over a year to write. And he says, nothing I've ever written has caused me so much pain as the writing, in terms of the hard work and rewriting. The point is, of course, that the area of the sacred is divinely notoriously refractory to language, and everything you say about it is going to be untrue because of the ambiguity part of it, and it's extremely challenging. But he, as a scientist, makes that leap and tries to come up with answers to these big questions that I've been talking about. And it's just a fascinating read, and enormous amount of wisdom, I believe. So what are some of the things that come out of that? So one is that we have this divergence of the secular and the sacred that happened around the time of the Enlightenment, and we need to get back to try to get back to that. And that's why, a lot of people are talking about wonder and awe and more. And it's more than just, it's a way to put aside the pain by going to say this picture was taken at Yosemite Falls, by going to see the Yosemite Falls and say that's beautiful, and that's just a mere antidote that you have for a week, and then you come back and you're you're wound up again. The idea is more, no, it has to be more, wonder and awe has to be integrated into your daily thinking, and wonder and awe around the human body that we've just talked about, wonder and awe around imagination. The idea that perhaps when you're in a certain circumstance and you're around a certain people and a certain thing happens, well, maybe that's not random. Maybe you were meant to be there in that time and place. And we don't like to think that's true. And I'm increasingly coming to the belief that it is. And I can point at meeting Mel. I mean, Mel and I met a few years ago, and we have these great conversations, and my life has changed because I've met Mel and people she's introduced me to. Is that random, or did something happen there? Well, I can at least say for sure I had opened myself up to having my antenna up for that. I think most people will accept that part. And then whether or not that meeting of Mel and a so-called divine appointment I had was preordained by fate, well, that's trickier. But at least having this antenna up is great. So what can we know with certainty? Well, we know every morning that the sun rises and that sets every evening. If you've made it to 70 years old, you've taken more than 500 million breaths so far. And in those two instances and all the other stuff I've talked about, you had nothing to do with it. None of us had anything to do with it. That just happened. So to me, and I'm a science, I'm a physicist by training, and this is an argument that McGilchrist makes in the book, that most physicists actually do believe that there's a higher power. Now, what it is, they don't agree at all. But the basic argument is it's more logical to think something is happening than it's random because of this complexity that we've talked about, and on and on and on. The odds that all these things have happened because they're random is actually less logical than to say there's something behind it. What is it? That's a whole other ball of wax. And so by thinking that way, you can start to fall back on the power of curiosity, gratitude, wonder, awe, kindness, and more, and faith. And it's not just a nice to have, it's something much deeper and much more real in being human and being part of nature. And I don't know, I think that's just for me, it's been a hugely powerful way to help myself deal with all things that are going on in an attempt to become a wiser elder. We're all third active people who are part of third act. We're all elders. And one of the things that I think, a notion that we all have is the idea of elderhood and wise elders. And you can be a wise elder at 20 years old, or you can be a wise elder at 75 years old. Life teaches us lessons to help us get wiser if we're open to it. And kind of go into faith. So McGilchrist goes into the notion of faith. And one of my favorite sayings comes from Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest, one of the most progressive, in so many ways, radical people you would ever want to meet. But he's a Franciscan priest, which might surprise people. But he says the opposite of doubt isn't certainty, it's faith. Because there's certain things that, like we just talked about, you can't be certain about. No one knows. So the only way you can do is approach it in a different way that's more faith-based and that which I think leads you to the sense of beauty and other things. And McGilchrist says, faith is neither certain or blind. So faith isn't blind. Faith is very aware of everything going on. It's not childish in its behavior. It's actually deep wisdom. And much of that is come from experience. Through life and through our experience, we begin to realize that there are deeper things going on. I would say that, and that they're important. And the last one I'll say is Einstein. Many of you were probably aware that Einstein became quite a highly respected philosopher later in life. And he was asked near the end of his life if he had any regrets. And one of the things he said is, I wish I'd read more of the mystics earlier in my life. And the term mystics is widely misinterpreted. I would argue that the mystics are the founders of all the major religions and some of the principal people that we've heard about in the various religions. So Saint Francis was a mystic in the Catholic religion. And the founders of the religions, one of them, I think it was Richard Rohr, once said in a thing I was at, he said, Jesus was a master psychologist. And I would argue, and I'm sure he would too, that all the founders of all the major religions were actually master psychologists. They understood the human condition and they were trying to teach us about it and also how to deal with it. So this will be the last thing I want to hope people will take away from. So we go back to the body, and we have all these systems, and we have all these components, and we have our brain. And we can explain how the larynx works. We can explain how the pancreas works. We can explain all this stuff to a certain point. But once you start diving under, you can't explain it anymore. Can't explain how these things were created. You can't explain where if you have a urinary tract infection and your body goes and tries to deal with it. No one knows how that body detects that and how it figures out how to attack that injury or illness. It's just not understood. And also in the time that we're during our gestation, our time in the womb, there is something like, I'm going to get this number wrong, but it's the right vicinity. There's something like 100 million cells develop per minute while you're in your mother's womb. The speed and complexity of that is just mind-boggling. And again, no one knows where's the blueprint from the human body. And the analogy that I think helps here and that McGilchrist talks about is music. And I can look at this picture, I can see the violin, I can see the drum, I can see the different instruments, I can see the players. I could take the music and look at it, and I can see all the component parts and I can explain how they all work. But then once the musicians start playing, something else happens. There is an experience that cannot be explained through any science. It's a totally experiential. And most of us, I would imagine most of us have some piece of music that we love. And that's something that's a great analogy for life. And it's the same thing as I've been talking about or everything else, but it's harder for us to do because we don't normally do it, looking out, or looking at each other and thinking, wow, I see Melanie. Melanie's amazing. That's just not the way, our society works. But many of us do have this experience of listening to music with all its component parts and the complexity and the way it goes together. There's the magic that happens that no one can explain. So, I'm going to end with that, and we're going to do, hopefully, if I have a moment, I'll do a quick little exercise around this. But I think if I could just sum away the takeaway from this, the hope and joy part is just to understand it's miraculous that any of us are here. It's miraculous that any individual is here. It's miraculous that we're all interacting. It's miraculous that some of us choose to get together and fight the lunacy that is going on. And that history also teaches us, if you go back to the late 1800s, and we had a speaker came in and talked about this, late 1800s in the United States was post-Civil War was not that different than what we're experiencing today. There are differences clearly, but there's a lot of similarities. For the next, up through the 1960s, think about what happened. And that was people at the grassroots started all of that, everything that happened. And did we get all the way through it? No. Did we get everywhere we needed to be? No. But we took care of many, many injustices, and that was based on grassroots work and people getting together and creating that change. And that's what we're up. That's our challenge now, and it's a big one. And I don't know. My final point was the next time you get down, put on a beautiful piece of music that you love and just revel in it. And with that, I will take any questions that people might have or comments. If you just want to make a comment, feel free.
Thank you, Dan. The chat is super full and really interesting. Lots going on there and a whole lot of appreciation and thank yous for this session. Bill's point is that the pyramid you presented is incorrect. Values are interconnected, not separate, so they go throughout it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I absolutely do. And I'm immediately trying to think, well, how would I redraw that if I was trying to do it? But no, absolutely, I believe that. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. So Barbara, who's newly retired from NIH and had some amazing, wonderful comments and metaphors in the chat, says on the idea that things are planned and that our meeting was not just coincidental. Um, how many people have you met in the last decade who you've never connected with? How do you connect with people other than through meeting them? Why would you think that the meetings that connect are preordained by a higher power? No, it's a bias to think that things are planned. Reed Kahneman, Kahneman. We could talk about that comment all night.
Yeah. Yeah, we could talk about that all night. And I actually would argue, and we would be a separate conversation. I think Kahneman would actually support what I said. That's,
Ooh,
you know,
Barbara.
so we're not going to have that debate now because that's a big debate. But it's a great point. I mean, yeah, that's the important thing is to ask yourself questions about that and come down one way or another on it, particularly on questions that have to do with taking care of yourself and working your way through whatever challenges you're having. But also, at the end of the day, we're not getting out of this mess unless a lot more Americans step up and and um, and fight back. So that's a kind of big thing is whatever it takes. And this now I'm going to get on my little soapbox a little bit, but we need to have a shift in the way people think, and part of that is trust and faith that if we all actually start to push back, we're going to change things. And it works. It does work, particularly at the state level, political level. You can go talk to your legislators, they're going to listen to you. But no, people don't believe that, but it's absolutely true. So you can go on and on. Rua.
Okay, this is Lewis with Rua, and I picked up on your mentioning of Albert Einstein as someone who uh, felt, looking back on his life, that he hadn't really fulfilled all of his abilities or ambitions. But one person who comes to my mind who is the best example for me of someone who combined in a balanced way science and reason and intuition and imagination would be Dr. George Washington Carver. And I would encourage
Mm,
you to read more about him. He made wonderful advances in knowledge and science, and was reputed to be doing this in a very mystical kind of way. And his early career was as an artist. So anyway, he left very few writings, but I think he was just a shining example of that kind of balanced development of his left and right hemispheres. And, and, and then I just would also like to recommend another of McGilchrist's books, very short and very accessible, is The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning. It's very short, like 50 pages, and it would be a good way to really get a good grasp of what he's talking about.
That sounds
thank you for
great.
both of those. I'm not aware of either of those. And thank you.
Yeah. Now we had one question in the chat early on that in the Q&A early on that we could talk about all night as well, but I'm going to throw it out there because it's here. As the new world is being birthed, are we being helped by extraterrestrial beings? Will we experience irrefutable and undeniable contact in my lifetime on Earth, like soon? I'm 83 and waiting. So I
I
throw that
love
out there with 5 minutes left in the call.
I That's a great question. These are all great questions and really fun to think about and talk about. I don't have I don't know what else to say about that one.
I love that idea that they're helping.
Yeah,
I'll take it. We need
yeah,
all the help we can get.
yeah. Who knows? It would be incredible to before I'm no longer on this earth to find out that that is true.
Yeah, it would.
Um, So with that, let me thank you for all this. And, any of you who have comments or thoughts or even like to talk about this stuff, I love to talk about this stuff. I'm learning stuff every day, and I learn it from other people and in talking to other people. And I also think this is really fun stuff. There's some people on the call here I can see who are friends of mine. And it's really fun to just sit down, and family members. It's fun to sit down over a cup of coffee and talk about these things. And it's so much more energizing and interesting than talking about the latest crappy thing that's happening in the political world. Not that I'm saying we ignore those, but it's, at some point one has to, shift, have other things to talk about. So thank you for all that. I love talking about it. I love your questions. I'm going to try if we can. Folks are very busy at third act, but the intent is to get an email out to everybody that would give you a link to the recording, that would give you access to things that either I mentioned or like Lewis mentioned earlier, other references that you can go get at. And there are two web pages on the solavita.org, solavita.org that have these recordings and also the resources that we've been talking about over time.